Now, one of the things that we've really been talking about over the past years, and I think hopefully Osman's logged in, yes he has, is the way in which the pandemic has been policed. So it's been a real issue. The fines that have been issued have been quite immense, and the people that have been fined have disproportionately been diverse communities, Indigenous communities, and public housing communities. We had talked in the media about issues, how directions are confusing and how they seem to have been applied inconsistently by Victoria Police. And we've also discussed in the media aspects where there seem to have been Victoria Police overreach and concerns. Osman Faruqi, who's our speaker tonight, he's been writing about these issues in the context of the pandemic for the Saturday paper and speaking out about them publicly as well. Osman Faruqi is the editor of 7am, which is Schwartz Media's daily news podcast. He was previously the deputy editor of ABC Life and an award-winning reporter with the ABC's flagship audio documentary program, Background Briefing. He's been a judge at the Walkley Awards and the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards. He's also an adjunct lecturer at the University of Sydney School of Social and Political Sciences. And he's currently working on a book about race relations in Australia, which is out in 2021. And Osman's going to talk about some of these issues about policing in general and policing in a pandemic to us about some of the things that he's noticed and the effects that that policing has had. There's also going to be an opportunity for questions from the audience at the end of the speech. So if you just pop those questions into the chat box, I'll read those out for everyone's benefit and for Osman to respond to them. But without further ado, I welcome Osman Faruqi and thank him very much for presenting today to our AGM.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak tonight at the AGM. And congratulations to everyone who's been elected onto the executive. Julia, congrats on becoming the president, and Julian, congrats on your term as the previous president. It's quite an honor to speak to this group tonight. I have to say, if you told me this time last year that I'd be addressing Liberty Victoria on issues to do with policing in Victoria, I wouldn't have believed it, because I only moved to this state in February this year, and certainly didn't expect to become such a, become so involved in debates around policing and liberties here. But that's the way life goes. And I have to say, one of the areas that made me, one of the reasons why I became so interested in what I was seeing, and I think, a lot of the issues that this group has been focused on around liberties in the pandemic, why I think in particular was so attracted to wanting to cover this issue and to talk about it. This is coming from New South Wales. I honestly thought, perhaps obviously now quite naively, that when it came to policing, I'd seen it all. New South Wales Police, an organisation, institution that I've spent quite a bit of time reporting on. I've reported on issues to do with the internal organisation of police, the way that the law and order auctions have been used over various decades by politicians in regards to restricting civil liberties and handing police more power. And I guess I'd been so focused on what was happening in my own neck of the woods, I hadn't really paid a lot of attention to what was happening in jurisdictions like Victoria. When I came down to this city just in time to get locked down and was seeing what felt like and looked like an even more heavy-handed approach to policing, I remember expressing shock, and everyone I knew in the sector sort of turned to me and laughed and said, "No, welcome to Victoria. You might think it's bad in New South Wales, but despite so many issues that the state government at the moment has been relatively progressive on, when it comes to the twin issues of sort of justice, policing, incarceration, that's something that they've been, quite out there on a limb, even compared to other jurisdictions." So I have to say, it was quite fascinating to sort of experience it firsthand in the middle of the pandemic. And I guess before I go into some of the issues that I observed and some of the things that I think we should be keeping an eye on as we move through this next phase of the pandemic, kind of wanted to zoom out for a second just to talk about the issue of rights in the context of the pandemic more broadly. And I think for me, it really got on my radar with something that a lot of you might have forgotten and a lot of people didn't comment on at the time. So when the pandemic first sort of struck Australia, and one by one, we were closing our borders to countries like China and Iran before eventually shutting borders everywhere, there was quite a few hundred Australians stuck in Wuhan, which is the first city in China that we decided to ban travel from. And at the time, the idea of hotel quarantine was yet to be raised. We didn't have an adequate quarantine system. So the suggestion by some in the government, first floated by Peter Dutton, the Home Affairs Minister, was to use the Christmas Island detention facilities, immigration detention facilities, as a quarantine for Australian citizens from Wuhan to quarantine in for 2 weeks before making their way back to the mainland. That eventually happened. And even though it wasn't explicitly targeted at Australians of Chinese background, overwhelmingly, the vast majority of those people who were sent to that detention center were Australians of Chinese background or permanent residents of Chinese background. And I found that to be an extraordinary precedent that had just been set, that we were quarantining Australians on Christmas Island, which is the location that is so synonymous with our appalling record on immigration and refugee and asylum seeker issues more broadly. Now, there's a debate to be had about the most effective way to do quarantine and the way that Australia manages this as we look to potentially open up borders. But I think it is important to note that at this point in time, there has only been one cohort that has been sent to that detention center as part of quarantine, and that was Australians from Wuhan, largely of Chinese background. And I think that really worried me. It really concerned me because there was fear, there was terror, there was panic, there was paranoia about what this virus is wreaking around the world. And we fell into a trap, I think, of letting the fear dictate or override concerns we had around liberty and security. And it reminded me of the first time I experienced this when I was growing up. I grew up in Australia. I have a Pakistani Muslim background, and September 11 was an era where there was the start of the global war on terror and a large concern around the fear of terrorism. And I'm sure so many of you will be familiar with the debates around liberty versus security back then. You don't need me to lecture you on that. But having family who lived in the US who were whisked away and interrogated by the FBI and held without charge for days without their family knowing where they were, I was reminded of that when I saw the way that we were reacting to the pandemic in those early stages, because two things happened that were the same. Essentially, there was an existential threat that we didn't really understand, that the public was rationally concerned about, but some politicians in charge were using to basically continue the kinds of policies they'd wanted to for a long time. And there was not, at that stage, I think, enough of an outcry. And I'm glad that we have not continued to use Christmas Island as a quarantine facility for Australian citizens, because I am still concerned that that precedent has now been set, and there was so little backlash and outcry to that we may see similar moves as we deal with future crises, whether they are future epidemics, pandemics, or of course the next big thing we all need to get through, which is climate change. And I think that was the first time I realized we're now entering a new phase in terms of what we are willing to trade off in order to keep ourselves safe. And of course, the next way that kind of manifested, and this time it impacted so many more people, was the way policing was used in the pandemic. And I know this is an extraordinarily complex debate around the balance between public health and policing. But one thing that I observed very early on was that Australia, again, seemed quite unique in the way we were using police to quite punitively enforce public health orders. Right around the world, most developed nations, there was some form of lockdown, stringent measures designed to enforce social distancing and to stop the virus from spreading. But it was really in a handful of countries. And when you look at similar jurisdictions like the United States, Canada, the US, the UK, New Zealand, Australia's policing, measured by the amount of fines that were issued as well as the sum of those fines. The amount of money we fined people was orders of magnitude more, in some instances 50 times more than comparable jurisdictions. We were doing something very different to the rest of those countries. And I thought, this is something that we need to be paying a lot more attention to. So I'd started to drill down and look at where fines were being issued, who they were being issued to, and whether we were actually enforcing these laws as a public health measure, or whether police were using powers awarded to them to basically replicate the kind of policing that they do generally. And the really disappointing thing was that it was very hard to keep track and monitor what was happening in those, with that, we had on one hand the greatest expansion of police powers we had ever seen, I think, in modern history. And even though we're kind of at the end of it now, and maybe it's, we don't want to think about it too much, I don't think you can understate. So you can't sort of overstate how significant it is that stepping outside of your home, except for 4 reasons, was a criminal offense. And something that was punishable by an extraordinary high fine. And if repeat offenses could lead you to jail, and all the consequences that occur if people don't pay fines that you all know about. And that's not me saying that we shouldn't have had a lockdown. That's not me saying that, we didn't need measures and potentially even enforcement to enforce those measures. But when you are on one hand expanding the control that the state and particularly the police have on our day-to-day lives, you then need at least an adequate mechanism that allows you to monitor, to report, and to allow concerns to be transparently raised as to how that's operating. And that's not what happened. And that's ultimately why I sat down and started to build a database by hand of where police were fining people, because at that stage, that was the only information that was available to us. And it was only available in one jurisdiction, that was New South Wales. And I was monitoring the way that each state was issuing fines in total, but only one state was telling you where those fines were issued. And so I built up my own database every day during lockdown. It was a great way to stay busy when I was very bored at home. I would pull the data from New South Wales Police media releases and input into a spreadsheet and sync it up with the number of fines issued every day by postcode. And the story that told over a period of about 6 weeks was that, shock horror, the vast bulk of fines were being issued in suburbs of Sydney that had high migrant and high Indigenous populations, as well as towns in regional New South Wales that were, if not majority, Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander populations, very close to being majority. And so what I saw from that was that we had a health crisis. The government had massively expanded police powers to deal with that health crisis. Police were using that power to replicate the way that they always do policing, which is to target those that are the most vulnerable in the community. And there was no link, it seemed, between the way police were using those powers to the way the virus was actually spreading. That story got quite a bit of traction, was picked up by a few different outlets, and it kind of helped create, I think, a bit of a groundswell for other states to become more transparent about the way they were using these powers and the kinds of communities that were being targeted. Victoria eventually, after a question in Parliament that was taken on notice by the Minister for Police, did release data from the first wave of the pandemic in terms of where the police were using their discretion around these new powers. And it showed the same pattern as I outlined in New South Wales, that there were 10 times as many fines in suburbs with lower socioeconomic status than those that were on the higher end of socioeconomic status. And the really disturbing thing, again, I'm sorry I'm using that word so much, because I felt like whilst this reporting was going on and whilst these issues were being raised and civil liberties advocates and lawyers and a lot of yourselves were raising the concerns they had, while caveating it and saying this is not about not doing public health, it's about ensuring that there's transparency and oversight as to how that's being implemented, the Victorian government doubled down. The number of fines issued in the first week of the second wave was nearly greater than the total number of fines issued between March and June. So there was an even greater punitive response to what was going on. And I understand, right? I lived in Melbourne during this. I understand the fear, the concern, and as we saw in the second wave, hundreds of deaths this time, not just people worried about catching the virus and what it might mean. but it reminded me more than ever. And this is, I think, you know, when I cast my mind back to that first experience I had when I was just a teenager, about seeing the fear of 9/11 be harnessed in this huge expansion of state power and a huge restriction on civil liberties, was, yeah, we're scared. But that is the time that's more important than ever in which to make sure that our governments, who say they're acting in our interests, the police who say they're acting in our interests, are having the spotlight shone on them to make sure that the power we're giving them is not being exercised in a way that is actually detrimental to the public good. And I think that's more important than ever for us to monitor as we ease away from the real concerns of the pandemic and look to wind back some of these extraordinary laws. And I'm sure a lot of the members of this group would be familiar with the situation in in New South Wales, which, you know, after sort of managing to defeat the bulk of the virus, started opening up its economy. It started allowing people to go back to university campuses, started allowing 40 to 50,000 people attend sporting matches, giving out grants to encourage people to go to music performances inside pubs and clubs, but still criminalized outdoor protest activity, even when it was limited to a dozen or so people. And I think that is another incredible reminder of rights that have been fought for for such a long time can be erased so quickly, and then it can take so much longer to get them back. And I think what concerns me is that that's what we saw in New South Wales, when the police response was a little bit less intense and punitive than it was in Victoria. So what happens in Victoria now, when, as we celebrate the virus being curbed and all but eliminated, do police and governments grant us the right to do things like gather in numbers to fight for issues, whether it's Jab Warung, whether it's against, you know, the ongoing issues of Indigenous incarceration, whether it's for climate change? Or are we at a point now where we've created a status quo where police can criminalize almost any outdoor activity, which we know skews towards them targeting the kinds of people and the kinds of activities they don't like, which includes protest? And I'm not sure that that conversation is happening to the level that it should be. Again, I understand that there is a desire here to make sure we are not overstepping and the public health issues are being dealt with. But I do believe that right now is the time to start that conversation, because the government and the police aren't just going to grant that to us, I think, out of the goodness of their heart. It's not how we won the right to protest in the first time. So, you know, I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation and the opportunity to speak and address all of you. And I really do hope that the conversation from here, you know, we're all allowed a summer break. I'll let you have that. You can hang out with your families on Christmas and relax. But, you know, by the time we get back and we hit the ground running, I think that's when we need to start saying, we did this, we worked together, we fought this virus off, and now it's time to fight for our rights again. And to make sure the next time this happens, whether it's a virus or whether it's something else, we think more hardly about what we're willing to trade off. And I think that's the lesson I want us to take away from this virus. It's not the fact that we did the right thing. We definitely were okay in suspending liberties to let that happen, because I do think there were an enormous amount of unintended consequences that still haven't shaken through. How many Indigenous people will end up in prison because they couldn't pay the fines and then lost their licenses and then were arrested for driving without a license? That is the next wave, if you like, of what we will see as a result of this punitive measure. So I think there are a lot of things to watch, a lot of things to keep our eye on, and a lot of battles still to come. But, you know, I feel more invigorated now, especially since I can enjoy Melbourne's nightlife and actually have fun in this town, to fight those battles. But thank you so much for letting me address you all.
Thanks so much, Osman. There's a few questions that have gone to the chat, and some of them are comments. So I'll just ask those, and then if everyone has any questions about what Oz has talked about as well in terms of policing in a pandemic. But the question from Julian was that we've been locked down for a few months in Victoria, and you've mentioned Christmas Island, and of course we know that refugees have been locked down in detention for years, and obviously in conditions worse than we've been in lockdown. And Julian's question is really, why have Victorians not developed a greater sense of empathy for refugees? Or perhaps do you think Victorians might have, or Australians might now have developed a greater empathy for refugees, that we've had a slight tiny taste of what it is like not to be able to go outside.
That's such a really fantastic question, and I think it even before we get to the issue of refugees, which I think is extremely important, I think it's worth remembering. Julia and I were talking about this when we were catching up about this AGM, that basically what we've seen with policing in this pandemic, and I think it's why there's been such an extraordinary reaction from the kinds of cohorts of people who never protest police behavior, right? When you think about the anti-lockdown protests, the anti-mask protests, the Free Melbourne protests, largely middle-class, white Australians, small business types who generally don't protest the police. And I think that's largely a function of the fact that for the first time in their lives, they're experiencing police activity or government activity that is generally restricted for the most marginalized. And I think the question is, as misaimed as a lot of their criticisms are, have we awoken? Has the government sort of inadvertently awoken a distrust or an argument as to why civil liberties are important? It's a very difficult thing to navigate because there's so many people from the far right associated with those groups. But is there an opportunity to say, you maybe have never thought about this issue before in your life? I guarantee you the Aboriginal community has. So let's have a conversation about how to, fight together. And I think that applies as much to, like while we were in lockdown, before we were in lockdown, refugees were in hotels in Melbourne in a lockdown that was much more intense than what we were experiencing. They weren't allowed to go outside. And I think it would be a shame if we didn't use this opportunity to try and build that empathy on this issue. I think it's so unusual to have a real world experience where the kinds of people who maybe prefer not to think about what Australia is doing to refugees have actually lived something similar, even if it's still not as heinous. I think that would be an extraordinary campaign to mobilize Melburnians around, because you can contrast the joy that we're feeling to the continued suffering of people who've been in this situation much longer than we were.
Thank you. Now, Spencer made a very good point in particular that we can't forget the Biloela family who are on Christmas Island and who've been there for a while, who weren't consulted on when the Wuhan transferees were put there. And I'm sure that would have been very frightening for them. And it's something to really think about, that there is that family who are really part of the Australian community as well, who have been in pretty dire conditions for a long time. Cresta's asked a question that, given that this is a global crisis and that obviously nations have had to respond in some way, has your research found any coordinated policies that perhaps Interpol or the World Health Organization might have published as guidelines with how to deal, how to police safely? What kind of models internationally have worked quite well?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and it's really fascinating because the WHO guidelines and most public health research and advocacy on this issue recommends the opposite of a punitive policing approach. And it's not just that in terms of this pandemic itself, in terms of most of these issues, the key principles that researchers and global leaders in this area focus on is community support, resilience, coalition building, and bringing people along with you. And often a lot of that work is done in the context of vaccinations and the concerns that have been raised from various different communities right around the world around vaccinations. And every time governments experiment with a punitive response, whether that's forced vaccinations or whether it's restricting welfare if you don't get vaccinated, that sort of stuff, researchers throw their hands up in the air and say, this is not how you do public health. And I think there's parallels in a lot of ways, though. I'm cautious to do too many parallels to this because, the AIDS crisis was so focused in terms of the particular communities that felt the brunt of it. But I think most people now who look back and study the way governments respond to that say that the biggest mistake we made was treating it like a law and order issue, like an issue where people who had a virus should be criminalized rather than one that needed to be dealt with education, community resourcing, and awareness and coalition building. And that has been a constant cry from people in this space for decades now.
And I think that's something we've really seen in terms of concerns that have been raised about whether people are being open and honest with with contact tracers, if there's concerns that perhaps they're either that they broke any of the directions or perhaps broke other rules that, for minor offending, that they might not feel comfortable expressing that because of the punitive.
Right. I mean, just very quickly on that, I'm sure there's a bunch of other questions, but one area that I think has been really unreported, and there was probably 100 more stories I wanted to tell during COVID than I actually had the time or space to, but of cases linked to some of the big outbreaks that we had, where the key reason why someone who had the virus did not disclose their full location or work behavior to DHHS was because they were international students whose visas restricted them from working a certain number of hours. And their concern was that if they disclosed that information, they would either be deported, fined, or jailed. And that's not something specifically related to just policing in COVID, but I do think it is a great example of how punitive measures and rhetoric that is about, we will punish you if you do the wrong thing, can actually have a completely opposite effect to what you're trying to achieve in this kind of crisis.
Absolutely. That raises one of the questions that Martin has asked, whether you've noticed a good example where there's something that's been able to successfully or effectively mitigate the fear that's easily exploited by populists, but that also it drives introduction of the government and police actions. What is an effective approach? Yeah.
Absolutely, great question. And one of the difficulties, so I've spent a lot of time looking at different jurisdictions on this in Australia and internationally. And look, it is impossible to do like for like comparisons because the level of virus varies, the level of government response varies. But one thing that I found so interesting was that in that first wave of the virus, from between sort of February to June, when all states and territories were in a similar situation, most of the virus was coming back through returned travelers. There wasn't a lot of community spread, and we still had a national cabinet, remember that was working relatively cohesively, and the laws are pretty similar. The ACT government took a very, very, very unique response. And look, again, the caveat is the ACT is a very unique community in a lot of ways, but the response there was that we have these laws, we have the same laws and public health orders as every other state and territory, we have the ability and the authority to fine people, but we will not do that until we have evidence that they are doing it in multiple flagrant ways. So what would happen in those instances were if someone was caught driving to an area that they shouldn't be, or trying to open a business that they shouldn't be, or trying to go somewhere that they shouldn't be, police would intercept them. Police would talk to them, they would issue them with communications, and they would leave details for them to follow up if they had any more information. The ACT fined, I think, overall less than 10 people throughout the entirety of that. And even on a per capita basis, it was the smallest proportion. And I think that reflects both the culture of ACT policing, generally the kind of demographic nature of the ACT, but I think it's also worth bearing in mind that the ACT has the highest population of public housing residents out of any state and territory in Australia. So it's not just all middle-class public servants who love to obey the laws. And I think that's a really interesting local example where you can use police to educate and inform, and that might give you a better overall impact than if you use them in the first place. Like when we introduced the mask laws in Victoria, there was so much concern that why don't police walk around with free masks and give those masks to people? Why is the first thing police do issue a $1,200 fine? And I think there are examples even in Australia, like the ACT, where police did take a different role.
Mela makes a very good point that one of the real problems in Melbourne has been too that the hardest hit areas have been areas of higher disadvantage and more multicultural areas as well. And that's really made it easy, I think, for people, well, not is this the wrong word, but it's really meant that people have been demonised. And I think that's really come through with the hotel inquiry too. And I think it's then come through where fines have been issued as well. So it's a real concern that, as you've said, the point is really that it seems that the bigger powers have been used to continue policing the policing status quo, but just in larger numbers.
Yeah, and that concern among marginalized groups, like this is no one, if there's any other journalists on the line here, please don't steal my story, but I've only recently discovered that in the United States, in the UK and in Canada, And I use those countries as comparisons because they're Anglosphere countries with similar, democratic systems as Australia, have been releasing data on the number of COVID cases by racial background. And that data has often shown that ethnic minority groups have been disproportionately represented. None of that data has been released in Australia, but I've discovered that both New South Wales and Victoria at least do in fact record that data. And I'm in the process of using freedom of information requests to get that data. And I think that is something, again, going forward, that if the government was proactively disclosing, might help us understand what's going on. So rather than hearing about certain people being overrepresented in police numbers, or hearing rumors about gatherings at Eid that are spreading the virus, if the government was saying, you know what, it turns out Sudanese and Turkish migrants are disproportionately represented because they're also disproportionately represented in contract cleaners, who are the ones getting this virus through their work and then live in, low income, high density neighborhoods. That would help us understand that this is a community that needs to be protected, and we should be protecting them using health measures, not one that we disregard, don't listen to, and when they get sick, we send the police in to lock them inside their homes.
I think you were just talking about the data release, and I think one of the things that has really struck me is the use of media releases or strategic media releases by Victoria Police. There was a lot of flack that Victoria Police caught in the earlier days or during the first wave, where there were articles criticising the way in which fines were issued, and those fines were waived relatively quickly after some criticism. But then in the second wave, the daily, I don't like this term, but this is what was used, the daily COVIDiot tally was released, and it was always the most ridiculous breaches, which of course don't represent the norm. And we do know that there have been fines issued that probably shouldn't be issued. What's your view on the way in which police have used the media?
I think this is such a perceptive point, and I think as much as the media can be a bulwark against erosion of liberties and can be an institution that helps us hold police and governments accountable, it can also be an institution that helps do the opposite, in fact. And police, I've written previously about this sort of quite incestuous and I think worrying link between media, governments, and police to help create an atmosphere in terms of community concern, community outrage, that then works for governments to respond to that, which they've created themselves by passing new laws, which police love because new laws give them the authority to do things with impunity. And the cycle sort of continues. I think the police are very conscious of that. They fed a narrative where, as you said, Julia, there was zero transparency from Victoria Police in the first wave. In the second wave, I actually think it's worse what they did. They would say that there were 250 fines issued and then give a handful of cherry-picked examples that they knew that the media would run with because the stories would create such outrage. For example, the story of, there's been 250 fines issued. 6 of those fines were because a group of friends went to someone's house, drank beer and play Xbox. Of course, the commercial media will use that as their headline that night because it is something that is very shareable. It generates emotion, it generates outrage. We're all locked up in our homes. My grandmother is in a nursing home and I haven't been able to see her for months. Meanwhile, these 6 COVIDiots are playing Xbox and smoking bongs, right? And that is the story that is used to create, I guess, a sense of, well, we've got to support these laws. Clearly, that's how the virus is spreading. What was happening with the other 194 cases? What were they? The fact that we don't have that information makes me deeply concerned. The fact that, when we did have this information released by New South Wales, it showed that those people tended to be Aboriginal people walking on the street, visiting family. It tended to be homeless people. It tended to be people that were already caught up in the legal and justice system in some way or another, having an extra fine slapped on them. The fact that that's what we know happens when the data is released makes me very cynical about why the police weren't being more proactive in giving us more information.
Absolutely. There's just another question from Pamela, who said that it seemed to her that the Premier and the Chief Health Officer did try to avoid the demonising of certain groups, and they were arguing against blaming people in the face of media who wanted to really publicly, metaphorically speaking, publicly criticise the people. What's your view on that in terms of really the message that was being sent by the Premier and the Chief Health Officer.
I think there was a distinction between both of them, and I also think that their messaging changed over time. I do think that at the start of the second wave, the message from the Premier was very direct. It was about, don't do the wrong thing. If you do the wrong thing, you will be fined. He was very clear in saying that in the first wave, police had some discretion to not fine people, but this time around, if you do the wrong thing, you will be fined. The Chief Health Officer, I think, never, his position doesn't really allow him to contradict the Premier, but his public statements were much less, I guess, bolshy in terms of the desire to fine people. But I do think there was a big shift from what the Premier was saying back in July to what we saw in the last couple of weeks. We did see the government eventually decide to not fine people who had broken the law, because they said it's more important to get honest information out of people who've got COVID than it is to fine them. That $2,000, $5,000 is not as valuable to knowing what towns these people may have gone to. And I think the concern from a lot of doctors and public health experts I spoke to was that, you can start to wind back that kind of narrative, but after you've spent months drilling into people that this is a response that will lead you to be fined, you're doing the wrong thing if you don't do this. And I think that takes a lot more to undo than a couple of weeks of, okay, we're going to take a more softly approach. But I do think that is ultimately where the government has now ended up. And I think that's a good place to end up.
Yeah, I think the messaging, I think, has been a big thing of what people think has caused spread of the virus too. And as you've said, that although there has been spread in some respects from people breaking the rules, the real spread has been in those insecure workplaces.
Well, I mean, one example, sorry, Julie, just to jump in if that's okay, just one example that's been polling done by The Age that showed that 50% of people thought that the second wave, was the result of people breaking the rules. And I think that reflects a media and police narrative more than it reflects reality, because we know from the government's own hotel inquiry that 99% of cases in Victoria were linked to hotel quarantine. Whatever you think about the hotel quarantine issue, that fundamentally was an issue to do with poorly trained and poorly paid contract workers. And we also know that more than 80% of the virus in the second wave was spread through workplaces. So there is a gap between what the science says was the cause of the virus and what the community thinks is how it was spread. And I think that's the concern in this bigger conversation about liberties, because when you have a false narrative of what's going on, then you have people willing to support things like the restriction of liberties to crack down on it, even though that's not really where the issue is.
Cresta's just asked whether the COVID legislation set up, or the direction set up a framework for VicPol to first use punitive measures, or was it at their own discretion? And I guess part of it too is, what role does the messaging play, do you think, in the way that Victoria Police approached these issues?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question again, and it's something that I tried to cover in some of my early reporting on this. So before we went into our lockdown, a number of European jurisdictions, including the UK, had, and the UK, when it passed its effectively equivalent of public health orders allowing police to do these kinds of things, they also issued quite detailed guidelines for police, one, to have uniformity across jurisdictions, and two, to give them really clear practical examples of, when someone's doing this, how should you deal with that? Is this part of the public health orders or not? Should you communicate with them before fining them? And that was a really coordinated, I think, response to acknowledge the uncertainty around this. We never saw anything like that. And that's why we saw such strange inconsistencies around, remember that learner driver getting fined, and these things kind of being clarified on the run. And I think that's the other reminder here. It shouldn't be radical that even if you feel the need to introduce extraordinary laws and powers, some kind of guidelines or oversight around them. And when we started debating the extension of the state of disaster legislation, state of emergency legislation, I really did think that was an opportunity for the Victorian Parliament to say, sure, yeah, look, we do need some rules, because even as we ease out of this virus, we're going to need legislation and regulation around the amount of people that we can put inside venues. Let's extend that. But the trade-off for that is, let's create an oversight body, or let's force police to release data weekly in terms of how they're using their power. And I think it was a missed opportunity that the Parliament did not use that, basically the fact that the government was desperate for this legislation to push for more transparency.
Thank you. I'm mindful of the time, and we really appreciate you talking to us today and answering our questions and talking about these issues. I think you really hit the nail on the head when you said that there's been an expansion of powers, but the policing status quo has really continued, and particularly in respect of the targeting or the disproportionate impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's NAIDOC week this week, and we know the issues with over-policing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in general, and the over-imprisonment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in general. And it's so disappointing that at this time, when we should be the most careful to ensure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past, the police response, unfortunately, has continued to disproportionately impact those communities. And as you've said, the fines are one thing, but the consequences of the fines can be much more. Either if people can't pay it and have a lot of fine, they might go to prison, or they might get lose their license or things like that. So it's really concerning that that's continued, and something that a friend of mine said, who's also a criminal defence lawyer, is how are we going to rein them in when we get back to COVID normal as well. But thank you very much for your time today and for speaking to us. Normally we would be handing you a token of our appreciation, but it's in the mail. Hopefully will arrive.
I got a message from Dan Murphy, who I assume is you guys. Yeah, thank you.
We thought we'd give you, now you can enjoy some Victorian wines, and we are glad that you have joined us and you're a Victorian. Unfortunately, you joined at a time that was very difficult, but hopefully as difficult as what's already at a time that was really interesting. And really something that will give us all a lot to think about in the future as well. But thank you very much for your time. And thanks everyone for your attendance today. It's been really great. And that, I think, closes the AGM, 6:30 on the dot. So we did quite well on that. Thank you, everyone. Bye.